I was looking at the historical context of the poem, The Lady's Dressing Room, and A Nymph Going to Bed, which are the two focus texts that we'll be looking at from Jonathan Swift. So we're looking at a range of topics here: marriage in the 18th century woman, um, conduct books for women, books that were written prescribing how women should behave at this moment in time, consumerism in the 18th century, cosmetics at this period of time, the toilet, a very specific meaning of the word, but it's a crucial piece of background knowledge for the poem. Swift's life and his relationships with women. So we're going to go through each of these sections here on this Edpuzzle, and I'm going to ask you questions about this. So, marriage was a highly important but contested feature in the lives of women in the 18th century. Swift's focus is on the fate of what would have been described as the woman of quality, which is an aristocratic or upper middle class lady who had been brought up to have certain social refinements or qualities. So we're not talking here about your everyday kind of working class woman. We're talking here about someone who is wealthy, privileged, and is expected to display certain qualities and traits. Marriage, for women like this during this period of time, would have been one of the only means by which to achieve economic security, as marriage was the only legitimate career open to women, and that's very deliberately in speech marks. And it was seen as being deeply unfashionable to be single. So you have to remember that marriage and the pressures that all that brings with it was the only way that women could secure some kind of economic prosperity at this era. In marriages during this particular era, women were expected to sacrifice individuality and freedom. So they were expected to basically do as they were told and to be a kind of subordinate person in the relationship, giving up the ownership of their worldly possessions to a man in exchange for legal and economic immunity. So we're talking here about actually relinquishing, giving up everything that they owned in their sort of legal possessions for being out of the legal and economic kind of circle or loop. So women at this point in time couldn't be charged with legal or economic offences. So they would give up all of their control of everything, but at the same time they would be free from any of the persecution or punishment. So women were also not required or expected or even permitted access to any form of schooling or education. So it's a consequence of their passage role in the marriage market. So they were not expected to have any education because it was suggested that they didn't need any. There was nothing for them to learn because they didn't require any learning because they were not participating in the world of work. They were, however, expected to display certain refinements such as skill in music, an ability to engage in witty discussions and to decorate things skillfully. So these were all expectations of women at this period of time. Some writers of the era mocked women for their seeming vanity and triviality. So some people from this period of time would make fun of women for their concern with their appearance, but it's really just a pressure of the social context at the time that they would have to be fascinated with their appearance because it was the way in which they were able to secure some kind of economic prosperity in future through marriage. But most of these writers do understand that these limitations in women's lives were the cause of social norms and factors that were caused by the way that society was organised at the time. Alexander Pope, who's the most famous sort of English poet of the 18th century, in a poem addressed to a noble lady, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, explained this point in his quote, "Impertinent schools with musty dull rules have reading to females denied." So he's criticising the world of education for not opening itself up to women. However, this famously well-educated and articulate female writer, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, laments the careless education given to aristocratic women. She is sad. This is a kind of sad moan about something, a lament. And the fact that we are taught to place all our art in adorning our outward forms. And this is very deliberately and directly connected to Swift's poem. The concern with self-presentation. This practice, she says, forces one to find as many excuses as if it was a thing altogether criminal not to play the fool in consort with other women of quality, who birth and leisure only serve to render them the most useless and most worthless part of the creation. She says here that we're taught to find excuses for not thinking, as if it were a thing criminal not to deliberately pretend to be stupid with other women. So there's a kind of conspiracy, she believes, of pretending to be less intelligent than they actually are in order to seem appealing. So there's a highly repressed, unequal gender balance between men and women in the 18th century when this poem is set. Conduct books for women are a kind of feature of this particular historical era and of these imbalanced gender norms. Conduct literature were really pamphlets of advice, little leaflets that you might get, written by women and men, directed mainly towards daughters. So they contained codes for behaviour, thinking, acting, and feeling, which would make women attractive for marriage. So it would tell you how to think, act, and feel in order to be attractive to men to marriage. They overlapped with religious conduct manuals to prevent women from becoming too mobile socially. So they overlapped with religious kind of pamphlets of advice in order to keep women in their place, really, to keep them in this sort of socially inferior role constructed by men. And from being aware of their abilities in the changing and increasingly commercial atmosphere of the 18th century. So this is an era where capitalism is exploding and the possibility of increased work is huge in its expansion. But women are denied any of that access to that world of work at this point. Conduct books were a means by which this happened. This is a quote from one by a man called Wetton Hall Wilkes in a pamphlet called A Letter of Genteel and Moral Advice to a Young Lady. This is what he says. Honest pleasures are not inconsistent with true modesty, but with an affected air of coyness and gravity is always suspected. When a young lady is praised for her merit, good mien, her kind of behaviour, or beauty, she should not reject such commendations with an angry look or scornful disdain, but receive it with ease and civility, if it be obligingly offered. So she should just accept this praise of being well behaved and attractive, because that is the way in which she is supposed to act in her role in society. So she should be happy about being praised for such things. Young 18th century women were not only told how to act and present themselves, but were even instructed on how to react in certain situations. Wilkes, above, in the one that we've seen, is an example of how women were expected to control the display of their emotions. So they're supposed to kind of coach themselves into a form of behaviour. A typical few rules of these conduct books would be the following. Number one, it would be unattractive for women to drink too much. Number two, it's important to have simple, good taste in dress, but immoral to pay too much attention to clothes. So you're criticised if you are over the top and excessive in your self-presentation. You wear too much makeup, you buy too expensive, fancy clothes. But it's also immoral to be kind of underpresented. So there's such a tight line there for women to inhabit. Women should avoid reading novels. At the time, they were seen as almost in the equivalent of like reality TV shows are today, as a kind of trashy entertainment, because they give young women a false view of life and lead girls and women to live in an unhealthy, dreamy state of erotic fantasy. They shouldn't spend too much time going out. This highlights a woman's frivolity and sexual promiscuity. So you weren't allowed to read books because it led you to believe that your life was, you weren't content with your life because it was boring in comparison to what would be in the books. You shouldn't drink too much. You should wear exactly the right kind of clothes. And you shouldn't go out too often because it's making you seem like kind of light-hearted and a time waster and also sexually promiscuous.